Today I want to welcome Jon Uhler. He has been a professional therapist for over 25 years, working in a wide variety of clinical settings, including outpatient, inpatient, residential, and hospital settings. He spent over 10 years working with adjudicated troubled teens prior to his 11-plus years working with incarcerated men within both medium and maximum prison settings, during which time he evaluated and treated approximately 4,000 low and high-risk sex offenders, including sexually violent predators. He is clinically trained and certified by the Pennsylvania Department of Corrections and the management of both sex offender treatment and dual diagnosis programming. His clinical specialty is in trauma-based disorders, especially as it relates to the trauma associated with ritualistic sexual abuse. Jon, welcome. How you doing?
It's good. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Yeah, it's great to have you on. I've been looking forward to this. Today's episode is extremely important, especially because we're now at a point where it's become very apparent that there are powerful groups of individuals that are attempting to alter humanity on many levels. And more over the past decade, children have become a major target for psychological operations and modern culture creation. And it's also apparent that many of these groups have extremely immoral ideologies and also have themselves been subjected to years of trauma, sexual abuse, and mind control, and will also do whatever it takes to not only perpetrate these behaviors through generations, but by also subjecting us and our children to their sadistic ideologies. Now, you're a clinical therapist that has treated many higher risk sex offenders and violent predators, and today we're going to take a deep look into the mind of these predators, as well as the ritual abuse that is possibly occurring at higher levels. Before we do any of that, tell us a little bit more about yourself, your background, and what led you to this work.
Chris, again, pleasure to be with you. I have a number of podcasts that I give an extensive uh, bio, but in brief, been doing therapy for about 30 years, worked in all sorts of settings, including a hospital program. That's where I first learned about trauma. Because unless you're aware of it in one way or another, you can't comprehend the effects. It'll shatter the mind. It'll compartmentalize things. There's a very good new modality. I highly recommend it. They're doing a wonderful job. It's called Internal Family Systems, or IFS. Frank Anderson, who is a psychiatrist connected with Harvard School of Medicine, and Dick Schwartz. So I'm going to make a plug for them. I have no financial interest. It's just really good. Frank Anderson was the consultant behind the movie Inside Out. So there's a lot of brain research in that movie. Remember Riley, and she's got the control board, and anger is, everybody's trying to take control of things. So I highly recommend that, right? It's a good movie based upon, it's an animated film. So Frank Anderson and Dick Schwartz have been doing a wonderful job, really trying to reframe, as it were, and destigmatize dissociative disorders, quite frankly. So I highly recommend IFS, Internal Family Systems, because it's a really good way of people, those that have been traumatized, and the greatest way you can, or the most significant way you can traumatize anybody, of course, is through sexual abuse. So I highly recommend that. So IFS, if you look for a therapist, ask if they know about IFS. And so it's trauma therapy is really coming into its own. I also recommend, and again, I don't have any financial interest, it's just good resources, is Bessel van der Kolk. Now there's a name, he's from the Netherlands, older gentleman. Bessel van der Kolk is really the leading researcher. He's a psychiatrist. He started treating Vietnam vets, guys, when they were coming back from Vietnam. He's written a book, best-selling book, called The Body Keeps the Score. I highly recommend it. Starts out talking about Vietnam vets or veterans. So what's nice is it's applicable for sexual abuse survivors or anybody that has been traumatized. tons of videos out there by Bessel van der Kolk, Frank Anderson, Dick Schwartz, so I highly recommend them. I, again, therapist for 30 years. It wasn't until working in the inpatient program that started seeing the effects of trauma. And so I ended up, really by virtue of, I think I was open to my caseload and started having a lot of survivors on my caseload. And I originally did not believe in, at that time it was called MPD, multiple personality disorder. I didn't believe in it whatsoever. I thought it was stupid. Well, Lord has a funny way of humbling oneself. So I started working with a number of folks, but one in particular, a gal who went into a severe depression. I met her in the hospital program. It was a private hospital. And started seeing stuff that I didn't have any context. I didn't have any way of framing what I was experiencing with her as far as seeing things. So I had to work. I didn't know there was any material out there. So I sort of recreated the way, in the sense that I learned the old-fashioned way, which is I was on that journey with my client, but trying to make sense of what I was seeing. And before I knew it, it's like, wait a second, I think I've heard about this phenomenon. I think I'm familiar with the concept of Sybil. So, but this particular gal, bless her heart, worked together for about 8 years. She has about 250 parts, shall we say. It's a very real phenomenon. And there's been enough research now, brain research, that you'll see different parts of the brain light up when somebody goes into different personality states, because trauma will simply take somebody's personality and segment that, and then they have a difficult time transitioning through what we all experience. There's different parts to us, and hence IFS references that. So worked with survivors extensively. If I was to pursue a PhD, it would be in this, because I know it really, really well.
Now,
then began working.
Go ahead, finish.
Began working with kids in the system. So I worked with severely emotionally disturbed kids in multiple placement failures in the foster care system, group homes, and then residential treatment. That was out in Southern California, and then transitioned from that to Pennsylvania. Was an acting director of Children and Family Services, or Department of Children and Family Services, for a year. And then opened up my own adolescent female 12-bed group home. We took the most severe of cases, step up or step down from psych hospital. And then after a couple of years, the Department of Corrections in Pennsylvania came calling, but in a legitimate way, but I turned them down. I didn't want to work but I had worked with guys, teen boys. That's the best. If you're going to work with anybody in prison, especially on a clinical level, I recommend you have to work residential treatment, because then nothing phases you. Right. If you want to know about yourself, you work with kids in the system, and they will tell you about you'll learn about everything that's true, everything true about humanity, about woundedness, about yourself. You'll find out if you have any buttons, because they will find them and they will push them. They'll target it. And that's why I can tell you assuredly the trans deception is false. It's fake. It's man-made. It's very dangerous. There are no trans kids. There are kids that are confused because their boundaries have been crossed. They've been exploited and manipulated, and people need to understand that. Prior to 2005, by the way, there was no such thing as a trans kid. There isn't. So people need to understand this is the world's greatest scam. It's a very deadly scheme, because once kids get on that moving sidewalk, it will dump them out on a surgeon's gurney. They will be sterilized for life and amputated.
100%.
And then they will probably commit. So the suicide rate dramatically goes up, because then we have a serious case of a kid that what amounts to, they've come out of a cult-like system. Now they awaken to the trauma. The majority of those kids are sexually abused, have sexual abuse in their background, and they're on the autism spectrum. Therefore, they have a difficult time trusting their intuition. Therefore, they're sitting ducks for predators who have no conscience, and therefore they groom or they get over on someone's intuition. So if you have a victim, and this is pertinent then to our discussion, the one thing that every survivor, that every victim of sexual abuse and not just sexual abuse, but any kind of, if you've been on the receiving end of a sophisticated manipulator or perpetrator or predator, the one thing they're working, the one thing they have to do, and we see it then on a global scale as well. So it's always the same because they have no conscience, and therefore that's the key to understanding psychopathy, by the way. There are two kinds of psychopaths. I'm certified in the Hare Psychopathy checklist. So I worked in the Pennsylvania Department of Corrections for on psych staff for 11 years, but through that did a deep dive into the minds of criminals. So the criminal mind, because the best way to study them, I would not have believed this in the, back in the day, prior to working in the prison system. You figure a researcher, he's sitting in his academic office. Maybe he probably has a background in criminology, and he's going to do a research paper on the criminal mind, let's say, or pedophiles. So how's he going to do that? Well, he's going to go through the laborious and time-intensive effort of interviewing psychopaths or perps. Well, where are they going to find that pool, that population? They're going to go to prison. Well, it's a lengthy process. You'll have about 3 hours with a guy, and you're going to take notes, and then you're going to come back, and you have what you believe to be firsthand, it's true, it's firsthand, definitive, reliable information from the world's greatest liars who actually are practicing for parole. That's why we have urban legends such as hurt people, and that these guys are reenacting the abuse at the same age of the victim that they themselves were victimized, and it is not true. And therefore, we'll be able also to talk about
Washington led the revolution. Lincoln saved the nation. Now, Galliana Chrysler Jeep is making history with double the customer cash rebate. Gotta go to Galliana. Double the customer cash rebate at Galliana Chrysler Jeep. And exclusive of that offer, lease a 2022 Jeep Compass with 0 down, just $379 per month. Or finance a new Jeep Compass at 2.9 APR for 60 months. Plus, get $5,000 off. Lease a new Grand Cherokee, Wrangler, or Chrysler Pacifica Hybrid and get $10,000 off. New Chrysler and Jeeps with zip, 0, nothing down, and 0 payments for the next 3 months. Or double the customer cash rebate. President's Day sales event at Galliana Chrysler Jeep on Greystone. I-126 Zoo exit in Columbia. Call 779-7300 or GallianaSC.com. Compass stock number 29165. 42-month lease, 0 down, plus tax and tag due at signing. Includes $225 closing fee, no security deposit. $17.92 per thousand borrowed for 60 months at 2.9 APR with 0 down. Subject to lender approval. Offers don't combine. Expires with that.
in the ritualistic abuse, my contention is this. If you have been perped on, if you're a survivor, you are protective, not exploitive. So what really within the realms that we're talking about, I'm open to, and I would have believed it 100%, that they are reenacting kind of because they've been programmed and now they're reenacting. My contention now is that is not true. It's a choice. So the ones that are hurting from generation to generation, I had a father and son situation. I had the father in my group. He never disclosed. His son was sitting, 50 miles away in another prison. They both perped on a nephew. They did it by choice. So it'll be interesting. That's my background. So as we get into this, it'll probably shake up the world of those that are looking into ritualistic abuse, because I understand, and I probably would have been inclined to say that, yeah, you know what? They're it's a cult-like induction, and now they are mindlessly going through it and they have to. No. So I'll shake up this discussion, because it really then, in my estimation, makes it even more heinous. It's harder to explain.
Yeah.
Right? Because it's easier to say, well, you know what, they were programmed or scripted into doing what they're doing, and now they're passing along. I don't believe that. I believe they're much more culpable. Right. So it's deviance.
Well, let's get into that. I mean, it's so hard for a normal person to even comprehend how it's possible to harm a child, much less do something terrible like rape or sexually abuse or even kill them. You said that these individuals are most likely making a choice, but they were also most likely subjected to their own sexual trauma and abuse from a young age, right?
No.
Okay, so let's get into that.
Isn't that shocking?
It is.
Now,
It is. So, because this is something
right?
I haven't heard before.
And I would love to believe that now, but I would have believed it prior to working with the perps. And again, I'm a certified sex offender treatment provider. I do 3 groups during the week. But the best way, or the real way, to understand predators is to work in a prison, because they're monitored 24/7. You have access to everything you need that no outside researcher or outside provider. So if you're a provider, I mean a sex offender treatment provider in the community, you don't have access to anything. It's reality. You don't have access to their files. You cannot file them. You cannot monitor these guys. Oh, they have ankle bracelets on, but you don't know what they're looking at. I can't tell you how many of my guys here, I think I'm doing a good treatment, but you find out from the POs, oh, the guy was busted with 2 phones and he had all sorts of stuff on one phone. It's like, oh, he seemed like he was doing so well. These are the world's greatest liars. How do we know? Well, did any of them come forward and say they need treatment for their significant, for the extent to which they access porn, which underlies 100% of all sex offending? Porn is the basis. I have a lot of people say, well, Uhler, so porn is. I said, yeah. Well, what about prior to porn? I tell them that the issue is, and this is pertinent again for the discussion, the issue is deviance, and I'll define that. So long before porn, there's always been deviance throughout human history. Porn and the internet, so ever since the internet, ever since porn, Hugh Hefner, who was Kinsey's pamphleteer, so to speak, Judith Reisman, she and I became close friends. She uncovered, unmasked Kinsey. She did the definitive work on him. Judith and I became fast friends the last 2 years of her life. She unmasked the guy. So Kinsey was a pedophile. He was a heinous sexual deviant. And he floated fraudulent research, some of which was conducted by pedophiles on kids. We've all heard the term. Kids are sexual from birth. That comes from Kinsey. It's fraudulent. Okay? Yeah. So Hugh Hefner then got his start from Kinsey, was influenced by it. So porn finds its roots in Kinsey, but now all sex offenders, in one way or another, are deeply steeped in pornography prior to offending, and 100% of all pedophiles. How do I know? Because I've done this. I did a deep dive into all the records, at least in the state of Pennsylvania, 4th largest prison system. I think it is. 100% of pedophiles are busted with child rape porn. 98% are also busted, meaning they have charges, for the dissemination or distribution, same thing, of that same material. So they're passing it along. You will not find an exception for a pedophile when he's arrested. I challenge anybody, find me one case out there, and you won't. So it's very telling that by the time somebody becomes a pedophile, they've worked hard to become a pedophile, because they didn't start that way. There's no minor attracted persons. No adult is attracted to a child body. That is a lie. Let me say it again. That is a lie floated by who? Pedophiles and predator apologists. There's certain academics that have a vested interest in shifting the narrative, shifting sympathies away from survivors onto perpetrators. Why? Because in the event that these guys get busted, including the academics, then they've hopefully, from their perspective, been able to buy themselves an insurance policy, because they can say they fell off the wagon rather than they're just deviant perpetrators. And the vast majority of pedophiles, by the way, there's stages downward, there's stages of pornography, there's a progression. The vast majority of pedophiles have already accessed bestiality porn prior to child porn. And then the next level is snuff porn, because that's how you silence the lambs. But I would have assumed, because we've all heard it in the textbooks, that pedophiles are reenacting their own abuse. They were traumatized. So when I started working with guys in prison, all of a sudden I started hearing this phrase that I hadn't heard before. Again, what population am I working with? Perpetrators. And so they assume people are going to take them at face value. So I first asked this, why would you take somebody who was the world's greatest liar, who did not step forward, did not confess prior to getting busted, and they'll never admit it's theirs. They'll never, no sex offender will ever come forward and talk about how much porn, but there's about 8 categories of offenders. Eventually, each category will, except for the pedophiles, and they'll never freely disclose. It's like pulling teeth, and inevitably, they're still not going to own the stuff that was found. Thousands and thousands and thousands of images. I just got off the phone just literally an hour and a half ago. Have a guy referred to me, sex offender treatment, and bright guy, because he can tell me different details about certain things. But all of a sudden, when it comes to what was found on his electronic devices, I'm not sure. And then, I don't know really, because I didn't really access it, even though age 9 or 10 children, that's the age range that was found. It really is surreal. But my contention is this, because what they'll float is hurt people. That's the first phrase I started to hear. And it's like, excuse me, because I've worked with survivors. Well, the one characteristic of a survivor is they are hypervigilant and overly protective. If anybody has ever been raised by a parent, especially a mother, it doesn't have to be just a mother, but if anybody has ever been raised by a parent or mother who she herself was abused, you watch that parent, you watch that mother when they go out. That mother is scanning the environment all the time. She's hypervigilant. She becomes almost like the helicopter parent. She's the one almost keeps her kid on a literal leash, right? If they go to the park for playtime, and if she is with other mothers may be, they kind of go off by themselves. They're talking. It's mother bonding time, woman to woman. Kids are playing. Let's say we have 5 women, 2 of whom are survivors. If we were to watch those 5 women, you will see 3 that are into the discussion, 2 are doing this. They're constantly looking to see where their kid is. Why? Because they know. Survivors are protective. They are not exploitive. When these guys told me they would use the phrase hurt people, I said, really? At first, I let it go by because I wasn't tracking. And then I said, wait, repeat that. Because they think that most providers, and unfortunately they're right, have bought this belief. Where did we get the belief? From the research? How do you get the research? You sit down with who? Perpetrators. So I'm taking at face value a perpetrator who's the world's greatest liar, who's a psychopath, a white-collar psychopath, 2 kinds of psychopath, bloody psychopath and white-collar. I'm certified in the Harris Psychopathic checklist, so the PCLR. A psychopath has no conscience, therefore no empathy or no remorse, and they know how to manage impressions. It's called impression management. They're always working people. They're analyzing. They're giving you what you want. That's why they first were sociopaths moving into psychopaths. And prior to that, they're narcissists. So it builds one stage upon the other. There's genetics and nature and nurture and all of that, but that's not the primary issue behind psychopathy. It's a violation of conscience. So if you have a guy that eventually has now offended children, he's done so on purpose. He didn't start out with that age. He was not minor attracted. It's pure deviance. Started out with adult material. He's lying through his teeth. Otherwise, how do I know? I had all the records. And these guys, because they become deviant, the working definition is this. They are driven by a desire to have a significant negative impact upon someone. For a child, they're driven to destroy innocence and mar and scar the soul. They've progressed through various stages. It starts with attraction. We're all attracted. Then it moves into lust, progressive objectivity. I'm now objectifying. It's not just sexual objectification. You can financially objectify someone. By the way, if you step onto a car lot, you are being objectified. Trust me.
Now,
but
why
they
do you
eventually will? I'm sorry.
No, I was just going to ask, why do you think that this behavior is somewhat more prevalent in these elite or wealthy circles where we hear more about these organized type of ritualistic abuse cases?
By the time somebody morphs into deviance, and that's really, I was driven to know. I've gone on a long time. I'm not allowing you to ask questions. Sorry about that. But I remember I was a therapist walking into the prison system. So I'm all about, and still all about change, hoping that we're going to reform all these guys. And I'm Pollyannish, and I'm still sort of Pollyanna. But I started in doing the treatment. And as a matter of fact, my first 6 solid years, and this is the reason why I was recruited. I was one of the few people recruited by the Department of Corrections. Because no psych staff wanted to touch it. They were sort of going to go on strike in a way. They were being required and nobody would touch it. So the prison system had to hire from outside the system, its own system. You know you're in trouble if a state system is looking for somebody outside. To start the nation's first intensive treatment program in long-term solitary confinement, which would mean you'd be working with the worst of the worst. Hannibal Lecters and rapists, pillagers, plunderers, all that. Okay. That's why the psych staff didn't want to touch it. So they made me an offer I couldn't refuse, so to speak. They lied through their teeth, but that's okay. They said they said there was an unreached people group. Well, that caught my attention. I'm good with that. But then they said I'd have unlimited authority, budget, all that. Well, that was not quite accurate, but there I was. So I'm in solitary confinement, working with these guys. The goal was to get them out unsecured. So we're going to put together a treatment program that had never existed before. And maybe I'm a little novel, but then again, if you're outside the prisons just aren't designed to do treatment. It's just the reality. So I stepped into this environment that, talk about outside the box, on both sides. The officers couldn't believe this was happening. And so I walk in and we start. And so through that experience, by the way, I've accrued more clinical contact hours.
Washington led the revolution. Lincoln saved the nation. Now, Galliana Chrysler Jeep is making history with double the customer cash rebate. Gotta go to Galliana. Double the customer cash rebate at Galliana Chrysler Jeep. And exclusive of that offer, lease a 2022 Jeep Compass with 0 down, just $379 per month. Or finance a new Jeep Compass at 2.9 APR for 60 months. Plus, get $5,000 off. Lease a new Grand Cherokee, Wrangler, or Chrysler Pacifica Hybrid and get $10,000 off. New Chrysler and Jeeps with zip, 0, nothing down, and 0 payments for the next 3 months. Or double the customer cash rebate. President's Day sales event at Galliana Chrysler Jeep on Greystone. I-126 Zoo exit in Columbia. Call 779-7300 or GallianaSC.com. Compass stock number 29165. 42-month lease, 0 down, plus tax and tag. Do it signing. Includes $225 closing fee, no security deposit. $17.92 per thousand borrowed for 60 months at 2.9 APR with 0 down. Subject to lender approval. Offers don't combine. Expires with that.
Boots on the ground time. More clinical contact hours than any other single prison psychology staff member in the U.S. or Canada. So I've spent more time in solitary confinement with inmates that are really problematic, because if they're in solitary for 1, 2, 3, 5, 7, 10, 15 years, you've got a really problematic individual. I've spent, just like Silence of the Lambs, you have Hannibal Lecter, Clarice. How many hours do you think Clarice spent with Hannibal? Oh, I probably spent more time with the Hannibal Lecters in 1 week than Clarice ever did.
Wow.
Just by virtue of it. And from there, then I headed up, oversaw treatment of one of the high-intensity forensic specialized units, 65-bed standalone unit for sexual violent predators, then certified in the Harris Psychopathy checklist, then did high and low-intensity treatment. Oversaw the mental health unit, or the specialized, what they call a special needs unit, for those guys that are either criminally insane or have other issues, including trans. And then I was the only psychology staff member in the U.S. to blow the whistle on inmate abuse. So I hold that record. That was an interesting time. Then after 11 years, decided to retire from the Pennsylvania Department of Corrections. But that's where I learned a lot about what is or isn't true. If somebody wants to go on, and see what I've written about the myths versus what is true, they can go to churchprotect.org. I have a list right there. And there's a lot of my research on there. At some point in time, I'll find the time to publish. But under the Truths tab, a lot of these perp apologists that try to shut me out because what I say is rather disconcerting for them because I place responsibility on these guys. It's not because they were wounded. As a matter of fact, sophisticated pedophiles, they were not sexually abused. The elites were not sexually abused. Well, that goes cross-grain to what we've all been told.
So we always hear, these guys were groomed from generation to generation to be psychopaths,
Correct. No, I'll tell you why that is not true. I wish it were true. It'd be easier. I haven't got all this figured out now because this is really, really challenging and difficult. But if you want to see why I can say that, and a lot of people, the perp apologists, especially on Twitter, they keep getting me banned on Facebook and Twitter, and I'm back on apparently. But let's say, Uhler, who's this Uhler guy? He's not published. Okay, where the peer review? I thought, I hate it when perp apologists have a point, right? They're doing this chess thing and this debate. I thought, you want peer review? Okay. I said, you know what? I'll go one better. I'm going to get professional peer review because it's one thing to have a room full of academics. I'm not minimizing it. We need academic research. Research should be quality. But it is conceivable that you can have research produced by those that have PhDs in criminology that have never worked in a prison. Mm-hmm. Let that sink in. Why? Because let's say I get my undergrad in criminology, and then I go for a master's in criminology and now a PhD. Where did I do my research? Well, I was able to gain access. I'm kind of go with this for a moment. I was able to gain access through the Department of Corrections and sit down with 7 murderers or 7 sex offenders for 3 days, totaling maybe 12 hours. So I have definitive, firsthand, straight from the horse's mouth, really important research. So let's say I've got 7 guys, total of 12 hours per guy. That's pretty good. I'm going to come back and I'm going to write a research paper based upon the firsthand reports. What they don't know is behind the scenes. Those guys are going back to the block. By the way, if a guy's in solitary confinement, he can't be interviewed. They won't bring him out. So your pool is limited. And on more than one occasion, I've heard guys snicker, like, can't believe, she bought the whole thing. And the interviewer doesn't know, because is that interview confidential? No. You got speaker systems, you got officers listening. Plus, it's going to be in the research paper. Plus, there are no secrets in jail. They know who has been interviewed. You don't think other inmates watch who's walking up to that interview? Absolutely. The most dangerous person to be in a prison is a sex offender. So why is the guy going to volunteer? Because it goes like wildfire. Why are you going to put yourself out there? That's very dangerous. Only if you're protected by the administration. That means you've gotten in good with certain administrators, certain unit managers. How have you gotten in good with it? You've worked them. You're the greatest manipulators. And therefore, what you're doing as the perp, as you're sitting down with a researcher, you're practicing for parole, and that researcher doesn't know it. And you also know that your information might be used to influence policies, procedures, and laws and sentencing structure by judges, and therefore you can get out early. It's a scam. And therefore, how did we start to hear that they themselves were abused? Well, if you're a perp and you want to flip sympathies, what are you going to say? You got one of 2 options. You can either be honest and say, you know what? I was just saturating my mind with hours of porn. I was on the dark web. I just progressed, started with Playboy and Hustler and went down and got into really enjoying seeing women get the hell beat out of them and choked. And then even worse, And then, watching them get raped by animals, and now human trafficking, and now eventually bestiality, and now kids, and then snuff porn. Thousands of hours. And I was trading the stuff. In now 14 years of doing this, do you think I've ever once heard a guy be forthright and come out and just be honest about that?
So basically, they're
Zero.
just kind of training themselves to enjoy and get deeper into this behavior, right?
Correct. And what happens is, so first of all sex offenders lie. You need to know that. There's a shock anyways. If they were truthful, they would have turned themselves in or confessed to their wives prior to being busted. So if someone waits until after being busted to confess, why should I believe them? Okay. There's something in it for them. Rare. Okay. I've had a handful of regular kind of inmates, so to speak, on occasion, because there's about 8 categories of sex offenses or sex offenders. The most mild in terms of offense, we call the young and the dumb, or I call the young and the dumb. That's the 19-year-old that should have figured out, okay, you know what? Let's move on to college girls, but he was still dating his high school sweetheart, or he was friends with the seniors in high school, so he went back and he's going to dances, and before you know it, he hasn't figured out, oops, we have an issue. So it's the 19-year-old that's statutory rape. He can end up in a group. He can end up going to prison for 2 to 5 years, give or take. And so he can be in a group. Can you imagine? Right? So we have the 19-year-old that was dating the 16-year-old. And now the father finds out of the daughter, and that kid's going to state prison. And he's going to be sitting in a group. Everything from child molesters to everybody that we read about, the heinous stuff. So I feel badly for those guys. Although talk about scared straight, or shock value, but it's very interesting. Part of my job in prison was to keep 3/4 of the group typically from killing the pedophiles, the other quarter of the group. Yeah. In group, because it's not separated by offense, it's separated by quote unquote intensity, high or low intensity. So what I finally figured out, I'd heard the term deviance because it's a term used in the circles of sex offender treatment. But it's interesting, the majority of providers can't give you a working definition. You say, well, it's kind of, deviant. Well, okay, so we all just say, they're deviant. Well, if you ask, well, tell me what deviance is. Well, Okay, so I was working hard, and somebody may be able to. I'm just not aware of the person, and not that I'm exceptionally bright. So somebody may also. This definition may be out there. I just have never found a definition that I'm going to give you, because it occurred to me one day, because my office was right across from the group room. And the reason I bring that up is after group, I would walk in. I had a big college-sized whiteboard. I was always charting and graphing because I had to know how somebody becomes the worst nightmare of a child or a woman. I was always driven. My coworkers, bless their hearts, you can be a psychology staff member and not care. So you pull open the manual, go through the cognitive behavioral stuff. It doesn't work for sex offenders, because unless somebody's criminally insane, and that's very few, and to figure out if somebody's criminally insane, it comes down to simply one thing. Did they pull the blinds down before they perpetrated their offense? Did they look right and left? A criminally insane person is the kind that wears the tinfoil hat and believes the mothership is up above. They'll be right out in the open with perping. Why? Because they don't know the difference between right and wrong. But if anybody tried to cover their offense, they're not insane.
Right.
They know the difference between right and wrong.
Now, I want to get into the aspects and your understanding of what is and could possibly be happening with cases of satanic ritual abuse on all levels, and how prevalent this really is, and how high up in the elite levels is this ritual abuse occurring.
Let me first define deviance, because unless you understand deviance, you're not going to understand ritualistic abuse. Let me give you the stages again. As a man progresses downward, goes off the straight and narrow onto the slippery slope. That's the best way to understand this. a guy's going to begin to decline in terms of character, in terms of morals, in terms of how they value others. The human mind, which is different than the brain has white matter and gray matter, but the way we process, a lot of it has to do with values. So my brain can be fine, I can be brilliant, but if my mind is warped, my brilliance will be used for very malevolent ends. And therefore, I will become the greatest pragmatist in the world. So I can be brilliant. I can be a brilliant chess player. But if I'm very evil, I'm now the things that horror movies are made of, one way or the other. I either am playing chess with nuclear weapons, right? Or the Jason Bourne kind of, or I don't know, yeah, makes good spy novels, right? When it comes to issues of sexual deviance, it's important first to understand what happens when somebody becomes psychopathic in that process. There are debates out there in the sense that there's nothing, at the end of the day, there's nothing definitive about those of us that have studied psychopaths. I have not published yet. I will. I'm hoping within about a year to be able to do some writing. Okay. But those that have studied it, and Robert Hare, to his credit, he was the first one to scan the brains of psychopaths, put them in, and we're going to get color imaging. Okay. There's no question any longer, so credit goes to him. Scan the brains of psychopaths. Now, these were men in prison, so these were inmates that clearly were psychopathic, the impulsive kind, the murderous kind. You've got to be pretty bad to lure your brother. You're in a hayloft. You lure your younger brother to the edge. You have a haystack down below. The younger brother doesn't know there's a pitchfork waiting for him. And you tell your younger brother to jump. And then you go in to your family for dinner and you tell them you don't know where your younger brother is. Okay, we would all agree that's a psychopath. That's a bloody psychopath. The PCLR is the forensic test that can assess that. I'm certified in that. But a white-collar psychopath, Robert Hare coined the term, white-collar psychopath. Where do we find them? We find them in politics. We find them in finance. Quite frankly, we find them everywhere. He believes they're few and far between. I do not. James Fallon comes along and inadvertently scans his brain. Well, he purposely scanned his brain. He was participating in a research study for Alzheimer's. But his lab also was used for forensic assessments of psychopaths. And so he would have two piles of brain scans. As he was straightening them up, he found one, and he says, I've got a psychopath brain in the Alzheimer's, and he peeled back the name, and it was his. So it's very interesting, James Fallon. So he's made $1 bazillion, good for him. But watch the different interviews of James Fallon. You'll see the audience lean forward because they're intrigued. It's like, oh. So he's coined a term, a pro-social psychopath. That's not accurate. What I would say is this: he's just really bright. He hasn't been, well, pro-social. No, you talk to his family. He will say once his family found out, the people interviewed the family members, the wife and a couple of sons, and they were pensive when they said, "Did it surprise you to find out that your father definitively is a psychopath?" And they said, "Well, not really, because not the bloody kind." Yeah. And so here's my presupposition, and then we'll talk about the mind, which is this: the best way to understand psychopathy, because the working definition is this. There are 3 characteristics of a psychopath. Then you can layer it with whatever kind of is their thing. But it always comes down to conscience. If you violate your conscience long enough, you will. That's where it becomes uncomfortable for all of us, quite frankly. It's much easier to say, nah, it's nurture, nature, it's genetics. Okay, some of those play a part, but then you'd have identical twins that would both be psychopaths. So my contention is, first, you get off the straight and narrow, you're violating your conscience little by little, and eventually you'll become a narcissist. There's 2 kinds. There's a sophisticated narcissist and a simple narcissist. A simple narcissist needs a mirror. A sophisticated narcissist doesn't care about the mirror, but both believe they are the center of the universe, and they believe they are entitled to you. So they become very self-entitled. But the more simple you are, the more people will notice that you're a narcissist, meaning if you're a simpleton. But if you really want to work people, you're going to make sure nobody catches on. So you start to perfect the art of being good at sales. Now you've morphed into a sociopath. A sociopath is just a really good salesperson. The place the sociopaths love the most is the ministry, by the way, because somebody can hold up that book, say, this book says what I am, and I am what this book says, and fill crowds and fill their pockets and fly around in private jets. And 2 Peter chapter 2, written 2,000 years ago, describes them. They help themselves to the cash and the women. Yeah. But a sociopath will stop when they operate upon cost-benefit analysis. So now we're getting into the elite. For a sociopath, they can stop at that level if they simply want the goods. But when the cost outweighs the benefit, they'll move on. The song from The Gambler, or the song The Gambler, you got to know when to hold them, fold them, run away, walk away and run. Okay, that's a sociopath. They'll love you and leave you. We had good times, nothing personal. I'll still, it's just a hookup kind of thing. Okay. But if a guy continues down that path, violating his conscience, and now the question is, how does somebody shift, in my mind, because people want to try to separate out, now sociopaths different than psychopaths. First of all, there's no actual designated term in the field of psychology. So people use it loosely. People will say that they're impulsive. The PCLR, your psychopathy checklist, says it has one of the facets of that being that the psychopath is impulsive. Right? There are impulsive psychopaths, but that is also, ready for that? It's not true in this sense. There are impulsive psychopaths, but the most sophisticated of psychopaths are not impulsive. They're strategic, they're calculating, they're methodical, they're extremely patient, and they know how to work the system. Another characteristic is antisocial. Again, those are the simple psychopaths because they have a limited body count because they're going to be busted, and I'm not minimizing that. They're going to be busted at some point in time. But how about Bernie Madoff? Right. Robert Hare's own definition of the white-collar psychopath is Bernie Madoff, who was head of the NASDAQ, made off with everybody's money. Bernie Madoff was not impulsive. He was not antisocial. The actual definition of antisocial is you're bumping up against the boundaries that society places. You're always going against societal norms. And Robert Hare, it's interesting, he said if he hadn't studied psychopaths in prison, which is interesting because he didn't work in a prison, he said he would have studied them on Wall Street, yet he'll also say they're fairly rare. He wrote a book called Snakes in Suits. My contention is this: they're not rare, and that's why when James Fallon scanned his own brain, had it in the wrong pile. We're all interested, but on my show on Friday nights, 8 to 9 p.m. live on tecn.tv, that's actually a counseling program. I talk about this in different terms. I call them dogs and pigs and fools. Those are the old-fashioned terms for what I say is a psychopath. If somebody doesn't start, so it's a downhill progression. If somebody doesn't stop at sociopathy, now the question is, why wouldn't they? That's a good question. But if they continue to morph, what happens is this. Each downward level or stair-step fashion downward, they're changing. They are objectifying. Our mind is originally designed to love people and use things. Okay, high value of people, low value of things. But with each incremental violation of conscience, my contention is this: you become inverted on the inside. The more sophisticated you are, the more normal you will begin to appear with each increment downward. So that by the time somebody becomes a psychopath, which is also deviant, there's an old-fashioned term. As a matter of fact, the book of Romans chapter 1 uses this term. It's not a religious term. It's very interesting. The word reprobate. Now, it's become so associated with sexuality that it seems like you have a reprobate mind, somebody's going to think, perverted. Usually that's the case. But the term reprobate in the Greek 2,000 years ago was a metallurgy term. What it meant is no longer useful for its intended purpose. So a reprobate mind is an old-fashioned term for what I believe is a psychopath. Because the one thing that is true is once somebody becomes a psychopath and they have a psychopathic brain, there's no going back. And I'll tell you why. From my perspective, they lose the ability to ever desire to be any other way than what they are, and they want to double down on it. Now, moving into, so that's deviance. You're now desiring not just to cross boundaries, not just to gain what somebody else has, not just to take what somebody else has, that's benefiting you. It's not right. It's immoral. It's unethical. You'll take their wallet, you'll take their body, you'll take whatever they have. But there starts to become a shift the further you go down to where you've taken everything from everybody. You've gained a lot. It's not enough then. Now it's about having a negative impact, and that's what you get off on, about the impact. Now it's all about chess. It's game theory. Now it's about working people. And what I tell even the guys in my group, because they don't know this, but when I start to describe it, it's very interesting. You can see facial expression. And so you can discern who are the psychopaths, who are the sociopaths in one group.
Do you think in some of these multi-generational families and circumstances that a portion of this behavior may just be learned from their environment?
That's a part of it, right? To try to unpack it is difficult. What I would say is at some point in time along the line, each person needs to decide for themselves.
Right. 100%.
The question, if this were true, then every single sibling would be equally as perverted and warped and sadistic. But inevitably, what you're going to find in one of these families is somebody escapes. And then they may even blow the whistle. And the question is, why do they do that? They went through the same kind of stuff because they had a conscience. A lot of this, right, gets to a point where it becomes very difficult to try to figure out. But as a premise, and it's really important to understand, and then I'll stop talking so much and you can ask me some questions.
All good.
But to set the stage for, so a really deviant individual, so deviance is, the working definition of it is I'm driven by, I'm excited by, I get off on knowing I'm creating pain in you. A normal guy, think about sex and sexuality, a normal guy can only enjoy himself and come to climax if he knows his partner is enjoying herself as well. But in the midst of the guy's ready to ejaculate, and all of a sudden she looks up and says, you know what, I really have to clean the ceiling. There are cobwebs. Or what's going to happen? The mood is going, right? He's affected by mood. It's over. He'll lose his erection, all that. Why? Because he's still fairly normal. Deviance isn't about whether or not she's enjoying herself. As a matter of fact, if she's enjoying herself, a deviant person can't get an erection. He can only get an erection knowing she's in pain. That's why they aren't normal and they're predatorial. So ladies, by the way, if anybody's listening, anybody that's into kink, 50 Shades of Grey kind of stuff, they're psychopathic. The guys are. They're predatorial. They're moving into that stage. Why? Any guy that puts a hand on a woman's throat, ladies, I have to tell you, you think it's fun and games. What's going through his mind? You have no clue, and you potentially are a very useful idiot, and you may never be heard from again. I've worked with your worst nightmares. Don't ever date a guy that's into porn. Not worth it.
Now, how do we go from just this deviant behavior to something like satanic ritual abuse? And what is your understanding of what is occurring during these rituals?
There we go. So now we have an understanding what psychopathy is. It's moved from sociopathy, cost-benefit analysis. If I'm succeeding so much, it's losing the thrill. And then I'm probably, more likely than not, I'm getting into really deep and dark porn. I don't know many exceptions of guys that are psychopathic that aren't into porn. Kind of goes hand in hand. Again, we think of some guy that gets into porn, he's going to wear a trench coat or he's going to be a freak of nature. No, think about Epstein. Think about Bill Clinton. They look more normal. Why? The more sophisticated they are, the more normal they know how to appear because it's impression management. And therefore, the higher up the food chain, the more normal you will appear and the more calm and the more self-controlled and the less impulsive and the more pro-social. And now you know how to start to work it. And a psychopath, again, since he has no conscience, and that's the key. Psychopaths, predators, same thing. They know us better than we know them. Why? Because they once had a conscience. People say, you can't say that. They're born. What I'd say is this. Can anybody show me a study where there's a longitudinal series of scans from infancy every 2 years up to adulthood? You can't. We have a single static picture, and then the rest is conjecture or theory. We know, okay, this is a psychopath. How did he become that way? Nobody wants to believe, and this is a scary thing, no one wants to believe that we all have the ability to become a psychopath. And I tell the guys that I work with, my goal is to be the best psychopath they've ever seen. Because I'm better at chess than them. Okay, so it moves from sociopathy. Now it's going to progress into psychopathy. Again, no conscience, and therefore what? No remorse. You're not sorry. You violate your conscience to a point where it doesn't work anymore. It's cauterized, calcified. It's over. The conscience is designed to keep me from violating your boundaries, crossing your boundaries. If my conscience, by choice, because conscience is going to bother me, so now I have a choice at first. If I keep overriding it, why am I doing that? Because it benefits me, because I want it. You can get to a point where your conscience doesn't bother you, and there's a tremendous degree of freedom in that. It's warped, it's sick, but there's tremendous. Can you imagine being able to, we say to somebody, because we project onto them, we think, gosh, that would be freakish. It's not. It's weird. It ain't good. How can they sleep at night? They sleep very well. Why? They have no conscience. It doesn't bother them. And now they're all calculation. And now it's chess. Why? Because that's the only thing that excites them, and they are now harmonizing with darkness. Now the question is, what's going to energize them? The further you go down, what you're driven by is degree of harm that you can perpetrate. The greatest kind of harm is defilement. The more innocent, the greater degree of harm, the greater you get off. And now you've harmonized. Now we're into very dark stuff. Now I must step away from what? Very natural thing. Now I'm going to get into Satanism. I'm going to hide it from the public, or I'm going to toy with them, because a psychopath is characterized by three things. They will have the last word. They have to. It's really the same thing with Satan, quite frankly. Okay. They're pure ego. They have arrived at the state of pure ego. Okay. So the world revolves around them. So they are purely self-entitled to do whatever they want. They're the ultimate pragmatist. They're driven to have an effect. So a psychopath will always have the last word, last say, and last laugh. What they are driven by is to work other people. It's chess. They are the chess masters, to work them in such a way that they're going to incrementally increase pain, because the psychopath gets off on seeing somebody in pain. That's why BDSM kind of crap. People need to be very careful. I have spoken to multiple men who've committed heinous things, that each of whom, independent of one another, because in long-term solitary you hear certain things, each of whom have described to me that something came over them. Now, they're still responsible, 100% responsible. But it's very interesting at that level, where they would start to talk about how something would come over them and leave them, come over them just prior to offense and leave them just after the offense. there's three doorways into the spiritual realm. And isn't it interesting? Drug, sex, rock and roll. Things haven't changed.
Right.
Think about Satanism. They'll always have two things involved in their rituals: music and sex and drugs. Okay, all three.
Yeah.
Those are doorways into the spiritual realm. When I work with guys, I have a number of guys that actually are porn addicted that I have in my regular caseload. I have one guy, very bright guy, internet security, interesting. He's going for his PhD, and he began to realize he's from a different country. Somehow he came across the Netflix series on Ted Bundy. And he started to realize that he was watching on his off hours. Guess what category of porn he's been watching?
Torture.
Identical. Absolutely. And so, kind of bless his heart, so to speak, he says, I think I realized I might have a problem. So he on his own, he's one in a million. He contacts I do online therapy. So he figured, you know what, I think I need to figure this out. Because he had already started to taking public transportation and rubbing up against women in such a way that they're not quite sure. It's always, by the way, if a man is stealing underwear, Sam Brinton, man stealing women's underwear, he's doing 10 times worse behind the scenes in terms of what he's accessing. That is a huge red flag that he is already offending, and he's a very dangerous individual. Within the trans deception, if any man thinks it's a reasonable thing to dress in women's underwear and drag, they've saturated themselves in thousands of hours of porn already. And you watch when those men go into the women's room, you notice when the women who are dressing as guys, they don't take selfies in restrooms. But the men do. And what are the men always doing in these TikTok videos? They're masturbating. When a man is doing that, and why was no clothing when Sam Brinton, remember the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Energy for the Department of Energy of Waste Fuel, Sam Brinton, the Deviant guy?
Yeah.
Busted for stealing, right? Okay. He stole suitcases. Which gender suitcases did he steal? You looked at that, right? You can tell, right? Stole women. Why do you think he stole it? For the underwear. Why didn't he return the underwear? He masturbated in it. How can you say that? I work with sex offenders. Why did he do that? Because they're raping the women in their minds. But they're autogonophile. I don't ascribe to that term. But they're really turned on by themselves. No, they're not. They are enacting on themselves what they've been watching, and they're actually raping women in their minds as they're feeling themselves up. These are very dangerous individuals, and nobody wants to say it. But when I've worked with sex offenders for 14 years, I can say it.
Yeah, 100%, man.
By the time some guy gets busted and he's doing stuff, real harm, you'll inevitably find that he's been stealing women's underwear. They're trophies. These are very dangerous individuals. And Sam Brinton was part of the Trevor Project, which targets wounded and vulnerable gender-confused kids that have all been perped on. The Trevor Project is in West Hollywood, where you have all the kids congregate because sometimes they figure, well, I'll go to a modeling agency and Sam Brinton also he defended a gay online site that promoted prostitution of young boys.
Jeez.
So the Trevor Project, in my estimation, they can prove me wrong. If anybody wants to come on my program from the Trevor Project, happy to have them. But you prove that's not targeting for means of child trafficking. So we set the stage for, hopefully I've given you, it's been a comprehensive look. So we've got somebody that has become a psychopath layered with sexuality, but oftentimes at that level, they're financials. So they are psychopaths that have access to cash and human bodies.
Yeah.
The further they get into psychopathy, they're driven by what? The desire to have a negative impact, to scar and mar the soul. They get off on now seeing somebody in pain. The more cash you have, you don't care about the cash. If you have billions of dollars, how do you comprehend that? So life becomes, you're at a different level then. So your entertainment, remember, you're moving into then a very dangerous and dark realm. Your brain ain't ever coming back, and you're doing stuff and you've harmonized, and you don't know where that line is when you crossed it into the spiritual realm. And now, guess what you're open to? Inevitably, you got a lot of demonic activity going on, and you like it that way. And I don't care if somebody uses the term or not. And suddenly, you're really being energized by stuff. Well, since Satan's all about getting God, well, how do you get God? You can't get God. What you do is like in organized crime, you can't get the Godfather, meaning you can't really hurt him emotionally. He's a psychopath. He doesn't care. You can't offend him. So what do? Well, you either give him a horse head or you get his kids. Now you've got the Godfather's attention. You always go after the kid. What does God care about, people? So Satan goes after the kids. He loves it because it hurts God and it makes God infuriated. That's why they go after marring and scarring the soul. And a child will stumble over, the Greek word is scandalon, scandalize. The English term is millstone. Jesus basically said to a would-be perp, you have one of two choices, and you better think very carefully before you hang that thing around a kid's neck, and they'll stumble over it the rest of their life, wondering if there's a loving God, then why? You better take that, which you're going to hang around that kid's neck, and hang it around yours and off yourself. Don't you even think about touching it. God cares very much about the kid, not the perp. So once somebody harmonizes with evil, harmonizes with darkness, they become empowered. What's the next step? Traumatizing and terrorizing. What's the greatest way you can terrorize them? You're going to gain access to them, and now you're going to, on a consistent basis, that's simply ritualistic abuse, meaning I have access to a kid in my power. That's usually why it's in the family, because this is somebody that has to have regular and consistent access. The term ritualistic abuse now is actually in the training material, in the secular material. They don't use the term satanic ritual abuse, but ritual abuse is now a recognized term that in the annual trainings that we all go through, anybody that's mandated reporter, it's actually now in there. I was surprised a couple of years ago. It's like, dang, they call it ritualistic abuse. That means somebody that has access to a kid on a regular basis that's using sex and sexuality in some fashion to harm a child. It's not the yanking, it's not the grab the kid in the park kind of thing. Okay, so this is more targeted. And what are they targeting? Traumatize the kid. The more sophisticated they get, they also know one thing. Because now it's just fun and games. Now it's just interesting. I mean, I don't believe I like any of this, but I'm going to pretend to be a sexual psychopath that has lots of money, and now I'm an elite. What do I get off on? The world is mine. I have unlimited power. Mm-hmm. It's now like Nero. What does Nero do? Well, we're going to dip people in tar and light them, and so that we have little lamps at night. Because I'm energized. Why? I'm harmonized with darkness. Mm-hmm. So I'm energized more by pain. The more harmonized I get. Well, how do you create more pain? More and more pain. Now you're going to torture. How are you going to really energize the darkness that's within you? You're going to go lower and lower toward innocence. And now the most fun, because how are you going to traumatize? I mean, if you're going to rape a kid with a baseball bat or a fork or whatever, you're going to do the damage. And they know about splitting of personalities. And then they know how the internal system works. And they know that on the inside, the greatest degree of trauma, the child can actually see the individual parts. And what they do is they see the core person, or they know, the perps know how to do this. And I didn't believe any of this prior to working with them, but sometimes you can have a lot of different parts. Again, the gal that I worked with had 250 distinct parts. And each part has a separate kind of handwriting that's very consistent, that you can have two journals going at the same time, so they can't copy the handwriting. Those handwriting styles are still the same, identical. You'll see spontaneous bruises, boils, water blisters appear on the skin, preceding the memory that comes out.